By the mid-1970s, the KGB claimed it had something remarkable. Thousands of newspaper articles planted across India every single year. A leader convinced the CIA wanted her dead, and an election operation running over 100 secret agent meetings. This is the story of how far one superpower believed it could go to shape the mind of the world's largest democracy, and the very ordinary election night that proved it couldn't. In 1969, KGB chief Yuri Andropov sent a message to the Soviet Politburo that reads less like espionage and more like an invoice. The New Delhi residency, he wrote, had the ability to organize a protest of up to 20,000 people outside the U.S. Embassy in India. The price tag, 5,000 rupees, to be drawn from the budget for special tasks. Leonid Brezhnev's reply survives in the files in exactly one word: agreed. Think about the scale of that transaction. A crowd of 20,000 people treated in the paperwork with the same casualness as ordering office supplies. 2 years later, in 1971, the Politburo went further, approving a secret multi-year fund. By 1973, KGB files claimed it had 10 Indian newspapers effectively on its payroll, along with a press agency under its influence. In 1972 alone, the KGB claimed to have planted 3,789 articles into Indian newspapers, likely more than in any other country in the non-communist world. The number dipped slightly in 1973, then climbed again, 4,486 articles in 1974 and 5,510 in 1975. For comparison, in some major NATO countries, the KGB managed to plant barely 1% of what it was placing in the Indian press. India, for whatever reason, had become the softest target on Earth. One of its most valuable contacts was a senior Indian journalist, given the codename NOK, recruited in 1976. He published material favorable to Moscow and reported back on the circle around Prime Minister Indira Gandhi herself, all without her ever knowing where the sourcing was really coming from. Every visit by a Soviet leader abroad came with a standing requirement. It had to look like a triumph, whether or not it actually was one. When General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev prepared for his 1973 state visit to India, KGB officer Leonid Shebarshin was tasked with one of the most time-consuming active measures jobs of his career, manufacturing the appearance of rapturous Indian enthusiasm for a Soviet leader most Indians barely knew. There was a real problem to solve. Brezhnev was, by most accounts, one of the driest orators among world leaders, and he genuinely believed a longer speech signaled greater personal prestige. Soviet audiences had spent years learning to applaud on cue. Indian audiences had no such training. His venue was symbolically enormous, the open square in front of Delhi's Red Fort, the same site where Nehru had declared India's independence 26 years earlier. According to KGB estimates, likely inflated, 2 million people showed up. If true, it may have been the largest crowd Brezhnev ever addressed in his career. But the speech itself was, by Shebarshin's own later admission, extraordinarily long-winded and heavy-going. Making things worse, the embassy had translated it into a form of formal, high-register Hindi that much of the audience simply couldn't follow. As night fell and the droning continued, parts of the crowd began quietly trying to leave. According to Shebarshin, police turned them back, apparently out of fear that a visibly thinning audience would offend the Soviet leader. Brezhnev sensed something was off. His own entourage reassured him anyway. And back at KGB headquarters, the New Delhi residency claimed much of the credit for what it called a triumphant visit, a success story built, in no small part, on an audience that had been quite literally prevented from walking away. By the mid-1970s, Indira Gandhi had become convinced the CIA was working to remove her from power. The KGB didn't invent that fear out of nothing, but archive material suggests it worked hard to feed it. In April 1975, Andropov approved an operation sending 16 anonymous packets of fabricated material to the Indian media, purporting to expose 3 CIA officers stationed at the U.S. Embassy under diplomatic cover. The forged material worked exactly as intended. It produced a wave of newspaper stories. According to KGB files, Mrs. Gandhi was convinced enough to send some of the very same fabricated documents to Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, Sirimavo Bandaranaike, who reportedly found the threat credible enough to launch her own investigation. One of her critics, Palu Modi, mocked the obsession by wearing a medallion around his neck that simply read, "I am a CIA agent." Mrs. Gandhi did not find it funny. In November 1973, at a state banquet in New Delhi, Mrs. Gandhi told Cuban leader Fidel Castro something extraordinary. "What they have done to Allende, they want to do to me also." She was referring to the death of Chilean President Salvador Allende weeks earlier, during a US-backed coup, and she accepted, without question, the Soviet and Cuban line that Allende had been murdered outright. Her fear only deepened. Riots in Gujarat in early 1974 that killed over 100 people, an Allahabad High Court ruling invalidating her own election, a growing wave of opposition, all of it, in her mind, traced back to the same hidden hand. In one especially chilling remark, referencing the real, well-documented fact that Allende had actually turned his own gun on himself as troops stormed his palace, she said, "When I am murdered, they will say I arranged it myself." On the 26th of June, 1975, she went on national radio and declared a state of emergency, describing a deep and widespread conspiracy against her government. Opposition leaders were jailed. The press was censored. Within the first year, according to Amnesty International, more than 110,000 people were arrested without trial. By January 1977, the emergency had ended as abruptly as it began. Mrs. Gandhi called new elections for March, lifted press censorship, and released opposition leaders from house arrest. The KGB's New Delhi residency, mirroring her own confidence, launched one of its largest election operations anywhere in the world, codenamed KASKAD. Over the course of the campaign, KGB officers held more than 120 separate meetings with agents. 9 candidates standing for Mrs. Gandhi's Congress. Our party were, according to the files, KGB agents themselves. 21 other non-communist politicians, 4 of them sitting ministers, had their campaigns quietly subsidized. In just the first 2 months of 1977 alone, more than 3 million rupees flowed to the Communist Party of India's own campaign efforts. Soviet officials summoned Indian Communist Party leaders to the embassy twice that February for direct exhortations to stay loyal to Mrs. Gandhi. Reports came back to Moscow reassuring everyone that victory was secure. Warnings that she might actually lose her own constituency were quietly set aside. The results came in, and they were nothing like what either Mrs. Gandhi or the KGB had prepared for. The newly united opposition, Janata, won 40% of the vote to Congress, Rs. 35. One of the KGB's most disliked opponents, Morarji Desai, became India's new prime minister. Mrs. Gandhi lost badly. According to her biographer Catherine Frank, India celebrated the result the way it hadn't since the eve of independence itself, 30 years earlier. In Delhi, people danced in the streets. For a KGB residency that had spent over 100 agent meetings, millions of rubles, and years of confident reporting building toward this exact night, it was, by any measure, a humiliating collapse. The lesson of Operation KASKAD wasn't that influence campaigns don't work. It was that even the most confident intelligence service in the world can spend years convincing itself of a story the voters were never actually buying. 20,000 rented protesters. Thousands of planted headlines a year. A speech so long the crowd had to be stopped from leaving. A prime minister convinced she was marked for death. And an election operation with 120 agent meetings that still ended in dancing in the streets for the other side. This story comes from material in the Mitrokhin Archive, notes smuggled out of KGB headquarters by former archivist Vasily Mitrokhin and published by historian Christopher Andrew. Like any single source, its specific claims have been debated by historians and were never independently investigated by the Indian government. What's harder to dispute is the scale of what Moscow believed it was buying and how badly, in the end, that belief was mistaken. If you missed part 1, the honey traps, the defense minister, and the making of a prime minister once dismissed as a dumb doll, go check it out next.